He was already standing in the doorway with his fishing rods when I opened his bag. I expected bait. I expected a thermos. Instead, I found women's lingerie, new, delicate, folded once as if to be careful with it. The price tag was still on the lace. A receipt slid out after it and landed by my slipper. June 6th, Clearwater Motel, $412.90. He looked at me, not moving, and said only one thing. "This isn't what you think." I stood in the middle of the kitchen with his fishing bag open at my feet, my hands locked around the zipper like they no longer belonged to me. The refrigerator hummed. The clock over the sink ticked. Nothing else moved. How could they do this to me? If you want to hear my story until the end, please subscribe to the channel and tell me which city you're listening from. I want to see how far this story travels. My name is Laura. I am 56 years old. For most of my life, I was the woman people didn't notice because everything around her kept working. I started working when I was 19. First it was necessity. Later it became habit. I learned how to stretch a paycheck, how to keep folders in order, how to remember dates that mattered to everyone else. In our family, I was the one who knew when the insurance expired, where the documents were kept, and how long we could survive before the next deposit came in. David came into my life early. He spoke softly, confidently, as if calm itself proved he was right. He never demanded. He simply expected to be understood. I mistook that for maturity. Back then, I believed a quiet man was a dependable one. Our marriage was never loud. No shouting. No slammed doors. But also no conversations that reached the truth. When something felt wrong, I adjusted. When something hurt, I swallowed it. I learned quickly that silence cost less than conflict. When our son was born, I became even more careful. Careful with money. Careful with moods. Careful with everyone else's needs. I postponed my own wants so neatly that, over time, I stopped recognizing them. Felt responsible. This was how capable women lived. David always said fishing was his escape from life. From noise. From pressure. From expectations. I believed him because I wanted to believe that our story had no hidden floorboards. He packed for those trips slowly, almost tenderly. I cooked meals, washed his clothes, placed his favorite mug in the car. I waited for his return with the quiet pride of a woman who had done her part. I told myself this was partnership. I told myself love changed shape over time. I told myself endurance was loyalty. What I didn't tell myself was the truth. I was becoming invisible in my own life. And now I understand something I didn't then. This didn't begin with betrayal. It began the moment I accepted being overlooked as normal. The first crack did not arrive with shouting, accusations, or fear. It came quietly, disguised as order. About a year before I opened the bag, David stood in the bedroom doorway while I folded warm laundry and said almost gently, "Don't touch my fishing bag. I'll pack it myself." There was nothing sharp in his tone. No warning bells. Just a simple request. I remember nodding, smoothing a shirt, telling myself he was only trying to help. Before that, I had always packed for him. I knew which socks kept his feet dry, which jacket still smelled faintly of cedar. Packing was part of how I loved him. Letting go of it felt small. After that, the bag became private. Always zipped. Always placed just out of reach near the door. If I passed too close, he nudged it aside with his foot, careful, casual, as if nothing had changed. I noticed the movement, then immediately told myself I hadn't. His fishing weekends grew longer. One night became two. Two became three. Then suddenly he was leaving earlier than planned, returning later than promised. His explanations were smooth. Traffic. Weather. A friend who stayed too long. I didn't argue. I adjusted dinners. I reheated leftovers. When he came home, something was different. He no longer smelled like lake water or sun-warmed fabric. Sometimes there was a clean, unfamiliar soap on his skin. Sometimes his clothes were already washed. "Did you catch anything?" I asked once, standing in the doorway. "Not much," he said, already passing me, keys clinking into the bowl. The photos stopped soon after. There used to be pictures, fish on newspaper, early morning fog, crooked smiles. Then there were excuses. The phone battery died. The light was bad. He forgot. His phone stayed face down on the table, screen dark, silent. One evening while clearing plates, I reached for it without thinking. He flipped it over instantly. "Don't you trust me?" he asked. The question landed like a weight. I felt accused of something I hadn't done. I shook my head too quickly and said yes, of course I trusted him. I said it because I didn't want the house to change shape. Because I didn't want our son to feel tension through the walls. That was the moment I chose comfort over clarity. I didn't know then that trust should never be used to stop questions. I only knew that keeping the peace had become my job, and I was good at it. Still, something had shifted. Conversations felt thinner. His laughter came later elsewhere. I could sense the distance without seeing it, like a floorboard that bends once and never quite settles again. The crack was small, but it was there. After that, the house stopped feeling like a shared place and started feeling like neutral ground. Not hostile. Not warm. Just quiet in a way that erased me. David remained courteous. He still said good morning. Still asked if I wanted tea. But his attention passed over me like a hand hovering above water, never touching. When I spoke, he answered politely, efficiently, as if responding to a task instead of a person. The fishing trip settled into routine, and routine has a way of numbing instinct. I learned the rhythm of his departures. Thursday nights became packing nights I was no longer part of. Friday mornings, I watched his taillights disappear without asking when he'd be back. Sunday evenings, I reheated leftovers and folded the same laundry alone. Time behaved strangely. The weeks collapsed into each other. The weekends stretched long and hollow. His phone never left his reach. It lay face down on every surface, dark and silent like it was resting. When it vibrated, his hand moved before his eyes did. He glanced, replied briefly, then slipped it away. If I asked who it was, the answer came easily. Someone from work. A guy from the marina. Always plausible. Always final. I noticed he stopped asking about my days. Not abruptly. Gradually. My stories shortened themselves. My answers grew simpler. It became easier not to speak than to feel myself fading mid-sentence. Decisions began arriving fully formed. He told me when he'd be gone, not if it worked for me. He told me what he'd already arranged. It wasn't cruelty. It was something quieter. Exclusion done efficiently, without emotion. At night, I lay awake listening to the house. The refrigerator hum. The ticking clock. The sound of the shower running too long when he came home. Like he needed more time to wash something away. I stared at the ceiling and wondered when I had stopped being curious. Once, while doing laundry, I found a small hotel soap in his jacket pocket. White. Unused. Wrapped tight. I stood at the sink holding it while the water ran over my hands, warming my skin. When he walked in, I dropped it into the trash without a word. He didn't notice. That moment stayed with me. Not because of the soap, but because of what it revealed. I had crossed into a place where my silence was expected, where questions were a disruption. I began observing myself instead of him. How often I apologized. How often I rearranged my schedule around his plans. How quickly I erased discomfort to keep the atmosphere calm. I saw how practiced I had become at disappearing. The tension lived everywhere and nowhere at once. In the pause before he answered. In the space he left between us on the couch. In the way my name sounded unfamiliar when he said it. Still I waited. Because waiting had always been my role. I didn't know yet that the truth was already packed, zipped and standing by the door, waiting for me to finally open it. The bag was heavier than it should have been. That was the first thing that registered even before my mind caught up. David was already standing in the doorway, fishing rods balanced against his shoulder, keys loose in his hand. His jacket was on. His expression was neutral. He looked like a man who had rehearsed leaving and didn't expect interruption. I knelt slightly and unzipped the bag. I expected bait. I expected a thermos. Something ordinary. Something that belonged to the life I thought I was living. Instead, my fingers touched fabric that didn't make sense. Women's lingerie. It was new. Carefully folded. Pale, delicate. Intentional. The kind of thing chosen slowly, not grabbed in a hurry. The price tag was still attached, brushing against my skin as if to make sure I understood it hadn't been worn. I knew instantly it wasn't mine. I also knew it wasn't meant to be. A receipt slid out next, drifting to the kitchen floor. June 6th, Clearwater Motel, $412.90. I stared at it longer than I stared at the lingerie. The date. The amount. The clean certainty of ink on paper. Proof doesn't shout. It waits. The kitchen felt suddenly exposed, like the walls had moved back an inch. The refrigerator hummed, the same sound it had made for years. The clock above the sink kept ticking, stubborn and ordinary. Everything else stayed loyal to routine. My hands locked around the open bag. I remember noticing the pressure in my palms, the way the zipper dug into my skin. Letting go felt like falling. David looked at me and said only one thing. This isn't what you think. He didn't step closer. He didn't reach for the bag. He didn't try to soften the moment. He waited, as if my reaction was the last variable he hadn't planned for. I didn't respond. Not because I was shocked, but because something inside me had shut the door on disbelief. There are moments when denial finally exhausts itself. This was one of them. After he left, the house stayed the same. That was what unsettled me most. The chair was still tucked in. His mug sat by the sink. The air didn't change. Only my position in it did. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. The same table where we paid bills, argued quietly about expenses, helped our son with schoolwork, planned trips we postponed year after year. My hands were steady as I logged into our bank account. I wasn't searching anymore. I was confirming. $950. Every 2 weeks. Precise. Repeating. Recipient. Emily Parker. Payment note. Fishing trip. I scrolled back slowly. 1 month. 3 months. 6. Then further. Full year. Each transfer identical, deliberate, labeled with a lie that had been practiced until it sounded harmless. Fishing. That's what he called it. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen until my eyes burned. I thought about the bag by the door. The soap in the jacket pocket. The phone turned face down. The way I had trained myself not to ask. I didn't cry. I didn't feel dizzy. I felt something colder and cleaner than anger. I felt understanding. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't loneliness or temptation or a moment that got out of control. It was a system. Built carefully. Maintained quietly. Protected by my silence. That night, I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house. The ticking clock. The distant traffic. My own breathing. And for the first time, I understood something with complete clarity. I no longer wanted to be a woman who was betrayed quietly. That night I did not cry. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling I had looked at for years without ever really seeing. The room was dark but familiar. The dresser. The doorframe. The faint outline of the window. Everything was where it had always been, as if loyalty could be measured by stillness. The house made its usual sounds. The refrigerator hummed softly. Pipes clicked as they cooled. Somewhere outside, a car passed, tires whispering against the road. Life continued without pause. Inside me, something had finished breaking. I had always imagined realization as something loud. Something dramatic. Tears, shaking hands, words spilling out faster than they could be caught. I had prepared myself for that version of pain for years. Instead, it arrived quietly. Not as a feeling but as a fact. I understood with a calm that surprised me that this was not really about another woman. It wasn't about attraction or desire or even intimacy. Those were only symptoms. What this was about was permission. Permission he had taken because I had been giving it away slowly, carefully, almost lovingly. Permission to leave without explanation. Permission to decide without asking. Permission to lie without fear. Because I had taught him that silence would follow. I replayed moments I had dismissed for the sake of peace. Words I had softened. Questions I had swallowed. Instincts I had corrected, so they wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. I saw them now not as failures, but as signals I had ignored for too long. What startled me most was the absence of panic. I didn't feel hysterical. I didn't feel lost. I felt steady, as if something heavy I had been carrying without realizing it had finally been set down. For years, I believed that asking questions would destroy my family. I believed truth was dangerous, something that had to be handled carefully, if at all. Now I saw it clearly. The destruction had already happened. I had simply been the last one allowed to see it. Near dawn, I got out of bed and walked into the kitchen. The floor was cool beneath my feet. I poured myself coffee into the same mug I used every morning. My hands did not shake. The smell was familiar. Grounding. I sat at the table as light began to creep across the floor. I opened a notebook and started writing things down. Not emotions. Facts. Accounts. Dates. Documents. Names. Evidence that existed whether I felt ready or not. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't planning confrontation. I was planning structure. For the first time, I didn't ask myself how to repair what he had damaged. I asked myself something far more important. What would my life look like if I stopped protecting everyone else from the consequences of their choices? The answer came without hesitation. It would look like me choosing myself, quietly, firmly, and without apology. And once that thought settled in, it stayed. By morning, the decision had already been made. Not the kind of decision that arrives in a burst of courage, fueled by anger and tears. Mine came like a door clicking shut, quiet, final, and strangely relieving. I stood at the sink rinsing my coffee mug, watching the water run over my hands, and I understood something clearly. I was done negotiating with reality. I didn't want a fight. I didn't want an explanation dressed up as an apology. I had lived too long inside careful conversations that went nowhere. If I confronted him in the kitchen, he would deny, minimize, and accuse me of misunderstanding. And I would be pressured to soothe him, to be fair, to be patient. I didn't want to be patient anymore. So I called a lawyer before I called anyone else. Her office smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. Even over the phone, her tone was steady, professional, and respectful. Like she had spoken to women like me before and knew the difference between heartbreak and clarity. She asked for facts. She didn't ask me how I felt. And for the first time in a long time, I was grateful for that. How long have you been married? She asked. 28 years, I said. Do you have joint accounts? Yes. Any property? Retirement accounts? Beneficiaries? Yes, yes, yes. I heard myself answer calmly, and it startled me. I sounded prepared, as if some quiet part of me had been collecting evidence in the background for years, waiting for the day I would finally stop flinching. That afternoon, I opened every drawer I had organized for other people's convenience. Tax returns, mortgage statements, bank documents, insurance policies, the title to the car, the deed, password lists I kept just in case. I laid everything out on the table like a careful map of the life I had built. The paper didn't weigh much, but it carried years. Every sheet felt like proof of how responsible I had been, and how easy it was to be used when you're responsible. I made copies. I scanned documents into a folder labeled with today's date. I created a second email address for legal communication. I changed passwords to things he couldn't guess. Not dramatic passwords. Not spiteful ones. Just new ones, mine. Then I opened an account in my name only. My hands were steady when I did it. I didn't feel like I was stealing. I felt like I was retrieving something that should never have been up for debate. My safety. With the lawyer's guidance, I transferred exactly half of what was in our joint savings. No tricks. No hidden withdrawals. No emptying the account to punish him. I wanted everything clean enough to stand under bright light. That mattered to me. When you've been made to feel irrational for years, you start craving a kind of integrity that no one can twist against you. I also canceled the automatic payments that were only in my name, the subscriptions, the extra credit card tied to my income, the little expenses that quietly supported a household even when the household stopped supporting me. It wasn't revenge. It was separation, financial, emotional, practical. That evening, I heard his keys at the door and felt no rush of fear. The old version of me would have panicked, rehearsed lines, softened the edges. But I had spent the day building something stronger than a speech. I had built a boundary. He stepped into the kitchen like he belonged there, set his keys in the bowl, loosened his shoulders. He looked almost relaxed, like a man returning to a place that would always forgive him. I watched him for a moment and realized how much he relied on my silence to feel secure. When he looked up, I said, "I spoke to an attorney today." The words were simple, clean. They didn't wobble. He blinked once, the smallest sign that the ground had shifted. "Why?" he asked, as if the lingerie and the motel receipt were puzzles with innocent answers. "I saw what was in the bag," I said, "and I checked the accounts." His face changed in increments, confusion first, then calculation, Then that familiar attempt to calm the situation by controlling the story. He opened his mouth to explain. I didn't stop him right away. I let him speak for a few seconds because I needed to hear something important. Whether he would tell the truth when the truth was the only option left. He didn't. He gave me words designed to blur the edges, to make it complicated, to make it sound like a misunderstanding between spouses instead of a deliberate pattern. And that was the moment my decision hardened. I held up my hand, not aggressive, not theatrical. Just a small gesture. I'm not here to argue, I said. I'm telling you what happens next. Separation. Separate finances. No more shared access. No more vague weekends. No more disappearing acts paid for with money he assumed I would never track. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult him. I didn't ask for permission. I stated terms. He tried to pull emotion into it. Our son, our history, all the years I'd invested. He tried to make me feel like ending this would be cruelty. But I knew the difference now. This wasn't punishment. This was consequence. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in months. Not because I felt happy. Not because it was easy. Because my body finally understood something my mind had known all day. I was no longer available to be betrayed quietly. The consequences did not arrive with shouting or exposure. They arrived the way consequences usually do, quietly, one practical failure at a time. The first thing that changed was the money. The systems David had relied on for years began to fail him. A shared card declined. Automatic transfers didn't land where they used to. Payments he assumed would clear simply didn't. I didn't announce the changes. I didn't warn him ahead of time. I had already explained the boundary once, and boundaries don't need repetition to be real. He noticed quickly. At first, he approached it as if it were a technical error. A banking issue. Something I could fix if I would just make a call. When that didn't work, his tone shifted. The confusion gave way to irritation, then to something tighter, fear, though he wouldn't have named it that. I stayed calm. I repeated the same words every time. Separate finances. Legal guidance. No shared access. I did not justify myself. I did not soften it. The second thing that changed was his confidence. Without my quiet cooperation, his carefully managed life began to show gaps. A weekend trip fell apart when a payment didn't clear. A reservation was canceled. An expense he had always assumed would be covered suddenly wasn't. These were not dramatic losses. They were small, inconvenient failures, but they were visible. And visibility unsettles people who depend on control. He started making more calls, offering explanations that arrived too early, before anyone had asked. He became defensive in conversations that used to be easy. I watched him struggle with something unfamiliar. Accountability without an audience willing to cushion it. People noticed. Not because I told them anything, but because his story no longer held together on its own. The hardest moment, unexpectedly, came with our son. He came to me one evening, standing in the kitchen doorway the way his father once did. Older now. Careful with his words. He said my name quietly like he was testing whether it was safe. "Mom," he said. I didn't know. I believed him. I invited him to sit, and I told him only what mattered. No details designed to wound. No bitterness disguised as honesty. Just the truth spoken cleanly. I watched his face change as understanding settled in. Anger surfaced. Then sadness. Then something heavier, disappointment. "I'm sorry," he said after a long pause. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. I told him this wasn't his fault. I told him he didn't need to choose sides. I told him my decisions were about protecting my life, not punishing his father. That was another consequence. I stopped absorbing everyone else's pain so they wouldn't have to. David tried, eventually, to pull forgiveness forward like a bargaining chip. He talked about history, about shared years, about effort, about how people make mistakes. He framed returning as healing, as maturity, as mercy. I listened until he finished. Then I told him something he hadn't prepared for. Forgiveness doesn't mean going back, I said. It means I'm not carrying anger. It doesn't mean I'm reopening the door. That unsettled him more than any accusation could have. Because anger invites defense. Dignity ends negotiation. When he moved out, the house changed slowly. Drawers emptied. Closets echoed. The space where his things had been looked strange at first, then neutral. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. Didn't ache. It felt honest. Consequences are not cruel. They are simply the moment when choices finish unfolding. And everyone must stand where they land. I did not rebuild my life all at once. I adjusted it quietly the way you adjust your eyes to new light. At first, the mornings were the hardest. I woke up expecting to hear movement in the house, the familiar sounds of someone else's routine intersecting with mine. Instead, there was only stillness. Not empty, just undisturbed. I made coffee and drank it slowly, sitting at the same table using the same mug. The difference was subtle but profound. I no longer waited for anyone else's schedule to begin my day. Time belonged to me again. I moved closer to the ocean a few months later. Not dramatically. Not as an escape. I chose a small place with light-colored walls and windows that faced water instead of roads. The first night there, I slept with the window cracked open and listened to waves instead of traffic. The quiet felt earned. My days grew simpler. Morning walks. A local market where the cashier learned my name. Evenings spent reading instead of rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I began volunteering twice a week. Nothing heroic, just useful. Folding. Sorting. Listening. I was surprised by how quickly my body relaxed when it realized it no longer had to anticipate disappointment. People sometimes asked if I was lonely. I told them the truth. Loneliness feels different when it isn't caused by someone standing beside you while looking away. What I had now was solitude, and it was gentle. It made room instead of closing it. I learned how much energy I had spent managing another person's comfort. How much of myself I had folded smaller to keep things smooth. Without that constant effort, my life felt quieter but also wider. There were moments of sadness. Of course there were. Loss doesn't disappear just because it was necessary. But the sadness passed through instead of settling in. It no longer owned the room. I began making plans again. Small ones. Then larger ones. Not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I could. The balance I found wasn't about happiness. It was about alignment. My life finally matched my values. And that, I learned, is a kind of peace that doesn't ask permission to stay. He said he was going fishing. For years, I believed that sentence without hesitation. I pictured water, silence, patience. What I didn't see was what it cost me to keep believing it. Trust, I learned, isn't taken all at once. It's collected slowly, in small assumptions you never think to question. What he was really catching was my silence. And he lost it. I used to think strength meant enduring quietly, holding things together no matter the personal cost. I confused loyalty with self-erasure and patience with fear. It took betrayal for me to finally understand the difference. I don't hate him. Hatred would keep me tied to the same story. What I feel now is clarity. The kind that arrives when you stop arguing with the truth and start listening to yourself. Silence used to trap me. Now it protects me. My life is smaller in some ways, but it is honest. Every decision belongs to me. Every morning begins without apology. I no longer measure my worth by how much discomfort I can absorb for others. If you are listening to this and something feels familiar, I want you to know this: you are not weak for staying. And you are not cruel for leaving. There is dignity in choosing yourself, even late, even quietly. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is stop explaining. If this story touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength. I lost a marriage, but I found myself. And that was worth everything.